Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Brigadier General Bowers, President of the Marine Corps University, I'd like to welcome General Al Gray, the 29th Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Charles Krulak, the 31st Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Carlton Fulford, General John Allen, the remainder of our distinguished guests, and everyone to today's Futurist Panel. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Mike Aldridge. I'll serve as the moderator, and I'm delighted to share the stage with three impressive panelists. On the far end is Dr. Harlan Ullman. He is the chairman of the Kill-Owen Group and a senior advisor to the Atlantic Council. In the center is Ms. Kara Frederick, Associate Fellow for the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security. She previously served as a senior intelligence analyst in the special warfare community. And closest to me is Mr. Nathaniel Fick, Chief Executive Officer of Endgame, a cybersecurity company, and he served as a Marine Corps Infantry and Reconnaissance Officer. As a reminder, the statements by the panelists are not for attribution, and the views expressed in today's discussion do not represent the positions of the U.S. government. So we'll start off with Mr. Fick. Nate, could you give a little bit about your background and how your thoughts about the future influence your profession and vice versa?
Sure, I've been thinking a lot about my background this morning because walking through this room is like a family reunion. This is my peer group. The people I went through the basic school with, many of them are sitting in this room. So we're of the same vintage. Unlike you all, however, I got out in 2004 after, just by virtue of timing, doing a tour in Afghanistan right after 9/11 and then one in Iraq when the war started in 2003. I got out. What I loved in the Marines was building and leading teams. I wanted to find a way to continue doing that in another capacity. I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I went to business school, grad school, the time-honored way to tread water and figure out what you really want. Went to business school and did a public policy degree. I wanted to pick up the vocabulary to build and lead teams in a civilian capacity. Along the way, I got to know a woman named Michelle Flournoy, who got asked to serve as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in 2009, and she had been running an organization called the Center for New American Security, where Kara now is, and Michelle asked me to come take over and run CNAS. I did that for 4 years. But running a not-for-profit in the national security world was really mission-oriented, and I loved it, but it's not why I'd gone to business school, and I was on this track with a venture capital firm to focus on building and leading technology businesses. So I went back to the firm and have been running one of our portfolio companies, a cybersecurity software company called Endgame, for almost 7 years now. And you know, it's easy to get cynical talking about the future because I was influenced by a mentor of mine named Richard Danzig, former Secretary of the Navy who was chairman of the CNAS board. And Richard wrote a great paper about prediction, and his thesis was that our fundamental desire as humans to predict the future is outweighed by our inability to do it. It turns out we're just not very good at it. And so something that I would like to try to keep coming back to today, or something I'll try to contribute today, is the human factor in innovation, and realizing that, you know, in many ways, like warfare, when the future is fundamentally unpredictable and multivariable and dynamic, I think what we need to fall back on is people and culture, talent and culture, and building organizations with the right talent and culture to allow us to innovate in a world where the future is fundamentally unknowable.
Thank you. Ms. Frederick, could you now talk about your background to some degree and maybe the influences of thinking about the future to your organization and how your organization has addressed that, please?
You got me? All right, okay. That was the biggest fear, so we've conquered it. Good to go. So I'm Kara Frederick. I'm an associate fellow in the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security. Thank you, Nate, for leaving it in good hands. So what we do there is, I think I can say confidently that in 2017, we were probably one of the first organizations to take artificial intelligence policy seriously. So from that, we have 3 discrete programs that we're running right now: artificial intelligence and international stability, artificial intelligence and global security, and our new program to counter high-tech illiberalism, and sort of talk about the contest between illiberal regimes and open societies. And as we see that contest become more pronounced, what does that do for the tech landscape? And what policy do we have to implement in order to combat this encroaching illiberalism on the liberal world order? Where I come into play and where my background I think is relevant and sort of can contribute to that scholarship and that research is I wanted to be in the Marine Corps. I chickened out. I signed up for OCS in October way back in the day, but got hurt playing soccer, chickened out, and I did the next best thing, and I went into the intelligence community. So I served in the intelligence community at DIA back in the time where McChrystal had this theory that intelligence drives operations. So they put us young intelligence officers embedded in Tier 1 Special Operations Forces units. So I was there initially to kind of get my feet wet in Bagram, and then later went to Mazar-e Sharif, and then ended my tours in Jalalabad, where I ran the intelligence portion of a 66-person kinetic strike cell, so drones, Reapers at the time, 12 orbits. It was insane, and it was beautiful. So just basically hunting al-Qaeda in eastern Afghanistan. After that, I was recruited to go to Facebook, where I was probably, I think, the 3rd counterterrorism hire in 2016, which kind of shows you how the geopolitical cognition of some of those companies didn't really exist in a robust way at all. So it was really only until the CEO had a picture sent to him from ISIS with bullet holes in his face and a noose around his neck that they kind of realized, yeah, getting terrorism off the platform is a big deal. And once they did, to their credit, they hired a lot of people with experience targeting these networks and really instituting the structures to go after them and remove this stuff from the platform. So right now they have a pretty prodigious capability to hunt counter-terrorists or to hunt terrorists on the platform, and there are lessons that are applicable to disinformation and just nefarious, I guess, content that's put on these various social media platforms. After that, I decided that I missed working in the service of my country, so joined a nonprofit, naturally. I actually went into tech policy and figured, because technological developments are sort of always outpacing governance, there was a way to kind of get in on the ground floor of these emerging technologies, particularly artificial intelligence and machine learning, and try to dictate and shape the way the United States government organizes to combat the threats, the malicious uses of this technology pose. So that has influenced my thought, especially as we talk about artificial intelligence policy. You guys, I'm sure, have all heard of the new National Security Commission for Artificial Intelligence, sort of a congressionally mandated commission given a bunch of money to really take these problems seriously and come out with pretty sincere recommendations on how to deal with them, and more how that affects American projection of force in the new environments of today. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about hard at CNAS, and I hope some of my network targeting and malicious uses of these new technologies can sort of help in that fight.
Thank you, Kara. Dr. Ullman, talk about your background and go into your opening comments about your theories about innovation and creativity, please, sir.
It's rather daunting to be here to talk about innovation and creativity when I think the gentleman in the front row ought to be up here, because I'd much rather listen to them than to me. I had the good and great fortune of meeting Lieutenant General Krulak on several occasions. As you know, he was a man of short stature, but cast a huge shadow. And he once remarked that to get into the Naval Academy and pass the physical, he had himself over the head to raise a bump so he'd make the height standards. I last saw General Krulak in Chicago at the Marine Corps Scholarship Fund. The Commandant was there. And the reason I was there was that my oldest friend from childhood, Bob Morrison, who was chairman of Kraft Foods, had given $1 million to the scholarship fund. And Lieutenant General Krulak was going to address him and thank him. And he got up onto the stage. He had a very soft voice. He took out a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and opened it up slowly and read it. And he said, "This is a citation. It's a citation for a Silver Star, which I, as Fleet Marine Force Commander in the Pacific, awarded to First Lieutenant Morrison in 1965, serving with the 7th Marines," and went on to read it. There was not a dry eye in the house. That is creativity. Let me begin by asking a couple of questions. First, what do General Al Gray and Bobby Jones, arguably the greatest golfer ever to play, have in common? I'll answer that. Bobby Jones said golf is played in the 6 inches between your ears. General Gray wrote on the Education for Sea Power Review that the most potent weapon possessed by sailors and Marines is our intellects, and I want you to remember that. Who was responsible for inventing the 3-block war, Stingray, mortars in a box, and assigning the best colonel in the Marine Corps to come down to be the commander of the basic school? General Krulak. And by the way, who was that colonel? John Allen. I cite those for interesting case studies into innovation. Let me ask you to think about the future. It's now 3 o'clock in the morning. You are in a carrier strike group, an amphibious ready group. You're ashore with Marines, some kind of a hostile environment where there are potential adversaries all around you. All of a sudden, the lights go out. Your radars don't work. You can't communicate. Your weapon systems have been jammed. And a flight of drones come in who are trying to administer a mission kill. What do you do? That is the future. So let me give you an architecture to think about the future. First, let me remind you that war is a conflict of wills. It's intellect. Second, war is violent, bloody, chaotic, filled with chance, luck, fog, and friction. For the last nearly 30 years, we have been spoiled because our casualties have been relatively few. Now, those of you who fought in Kandahar or in Fallujah understand this, but for the main, we've had relatively few casualties. That's not going to happen necessarily in the next war. So what do we do about that? Let me offer you a framework to think about. 25 years ago, a group of us, former senior officers who had fought in Desert Storm, got together because we were very uncomfortable about how America was going about its military thinking. This group included Tom Morgan, who had been the assistant commandant during Desert Storm, Admiral Bud Edney, who was commander-in-chief of the Atlantic, Chuck Horner, who ran the air war in Desert Storm, and Freddie Franks, not Tommy Franks, Freddie Franks, who commanded 7 Corps in that left flank movement to trap Saddam Hussein. We came up with a notion of shock and awe. Shock and awe was based on a very, very simple idea, that the intent was to be able to affect, influence, and control will and perception of the adversary. It had 4 parts. First was to gain total or near total knowledge and understanding of the situation in which you are going to use force, something we have not been very good at doing. Secondly, it was out to control the battlefield and the environment, to do so not just physically, but to control the electromagnetic and visual spectrum so that the enemy would see what you wanted it to see or be denied of all that. Thirdly, brilliance in execution was essential. Good was not good enough. And finally, we had to be rapid in what we did. Speed of light may not be fast enough. For those of you who were here last week listening to General Allen's commentary on hyperwar, that's a case in point. So how do we put this together? Some time ago, I came up with a concept of a brains-based approach to strategic thinking. Now, some of you will say that's arrogant. Others of you will say, well, we should be doing that, but we don't. The British, under General Sir Nick Carter, who's now chief of their defense staff, has adopted this way of thinking. It has 3 components. First of all, and most importantly, you have to realize that the 21st century is not the 20th century. It is far different. Concepts like deterrence and defense that worked then may not work today. For example, how do you deter the Russians from active measures? How do you deter the Chinese from militarizing small islands? We don't know how to do that. And what has changed fundamentally is the diffusion of power and globalization that has empowered states, non-states, and individuals. Russia and China are part of this empowerment. So are non-state actors like Daesh, the Islamic State, or Al-Qaeda, and individuals, whether Osama bin Laden or Edward Snowden, or an 8-year-old kid who takes out his or her cell phone and inadvertently or advertently cuts off all the power in Northern Virginia, are things with which we have to understand. So when you're doing operations, you need to understand the 21st century is far different. The second thing is that we need knowledge and understanding of the situation. We need to do that far better because today, quite frankly, we don't. In 2001, very few people knew the difference between Sunni and Shia. When I went into Vietnam, about the same time my friend Bob Morrison did, we were clueless about that. So knowledge and understanding, the more that you know about the situation, about conditions, critical. Secondly, you have to have the view that you need to affect, influence, and control will and perception of the adversary. That's what it's all about. If you don't have that, it's not going to work. And finally, you need to pick a military campaign of the past, whether it's Scipio Africanus, Caesar, the Marine advance from the Chosin Reservoir in 1950. Understand and get down to the basics of war, of what happened, why it happened, and when it happened. I pick the Guadalcanal naval campaign, and I know that General Bowers has used that, Operation Watchtower. It is vital to understand for very, very many reasons. We thought during the interwar period we were preparing for World War II. We were not. When the Marines went ashore in August of 1942, they had Springfield rifles, and they were not prepared for the conditions on Guadalcanal, and indeed disease, and indeed the problems that they would have from starvation and dealing with the environment. The Navy was uniquely unready. Its command failed in many levels. Admiral Gormley, who commanded in Noumea, was 1,500 miles away and had to be ordered by Admiral Nimitz to visit the battlefield. And if you take a look at some of the tactical actions, our admirals were not ready, and in some cases, admirals who had more seniority and lacked the experience were put in command with disastrous effects. Now, how do you apply all this sort of thinking to the future? First, I would look at the squad level, the individual rifleman level, the platoon, the company, the MEU, the MEB, and the MEF. How can we do things far differently? How can we innovate? How can we make use of our resources in this situation that could develop, and the one that I described when it's 3 o'clock in the morning and the lights go out? Let me give you several takeaways. Remember Bobby Jones and General Gray. It's up here that matters. And to put a naval element into this, Admiral Arleigh Burke, arguably one of the greatest admirals in naval history, when the Arleigh Burke class of ship was being commissioned in Bath Iron Works, I was fortunate to fly up on the same plane with Admiral Burke. And when Admiral Burke stood up to give his speech, the last line was very, very telling. Arleigh said, "This ship was meant to fight, and the crew better know how." You are Marines, you are meant to fight, and you better know how. Semper Fidelis, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Harlan. Now, coming back to Nate. Recently, there have been some private companies that have expressed objections with these related to the new technologies and the military's use of these new technologies. Can you discuss or describe, maybe from being in the private sector, how that would come about and maybe how the military could build a better relationship? Because many of these technologies will be integral in future war. I'm talking about biometrics, autonomous systems, machine learning, AI. Can you discuss that for the group, please?
Sure. I think it's easy just to say, you know, we need to have patriotic corporate leaders who understand that we need the engines of innovation in our economy to contribute to our national well-being. It's a lot harder to make that happen. And so maybe a more nuanced answer requires us to look at how we got here. I mean, I think that you know, and first of all, I look at this through the lens of my personal experience, right? I run a company that has a team in Washington, D.C. with a lot of people who came out of places like the NSA, and a secure facility and plenty of cleared team members and all of that. I have an office in San Francisco where the team comes in on Monday morning and says, hey, sorry, boss, no security clearance for another 7 years, right? And yet, to build the kind of products that we need to build, we need both. We need the adversary understanding that comes out of the government generally, but we also need people who know how to build and ship stable, scalable enterprise software, and that's something the government's not very good at. And so I think, in a way that's emblematic of the cultural divide that exists in a lot of these big technology companies. I think a couple recently that have been in the news on that topic are Google and Microsoft, with the difference that the Google leadership generally gave in to a group of engineers who said, we don't want to work on DoD programs, and the Microsoft leadership more or less successfully beat that back. But we're going to keep seeing this. And I think without a doubt, in my view, there is some fault on the government side. I think that there have been cases with the iPhone and some other things where government policies sort of needlessly antagonized some of the technical talent in the private sector that we need engaged on national security issues. But on balance, I think it's an issue of kind of ignorance. It's poor leadership, and it's a cultural divide that exists between these two communities. Ignorance and poor leadership being primarily on the private sector side, in my view. There are mechanisms in place to help bridge the gap. Little green shoots, that are beginning to bridge the gap. Places like In-Q-Tel that reaches out on behalf of the intelligence community to invest in technology companies, or DIUX inside DoD. But look, I think more systemic change on this front requires better leadership. It requires leadership on the government side to articulate the case for why some of these things matter. It requires leadership on the private sector side that says, look, if we're benefiting from the educational system and the tax and regulatory environment in this country that encourages business creation and growth, then we have a duty to contribute. So that's not I wish I had a 1, 2, 3-step plan to give you. I think it's a broader cultural issue, and it requires better communication on both sides. And actually, I think it's worth recognizing in this room that there's probably some merit on both sides.
Excellent. Kara, you recently authored an article published in the Wall Street Journal called The Autocrat's New Toolkit. I think that's a subset of a program at CNAS. Could you explain what that is, why these new tools may be beneficial to autocrats, and maybe some ways that democratic countries could empower these tools or use these tools to counter that?
Definitely. So my co-author, I didn't write this alone. I co-authored this article with our CEO, Richard Fontaine, who was McCain's foreign policy advisor for nearly a decade. And what we did is we sort of noticed that there is a collection of technologies, what we called a new suite of technologies, that really stood to supercharge authoritarianisms and the control over their own populations and any repressive means that they utilize to make sure that their populations were managed properly. And you'll hear implicit in what I'm about to say is China's use of a lot of these technologies. So all of you in the China program, I'm sure your ears are perking up at this point. So when we identified this new suite of technologies, we looked at it in the context of the technology world, right? So technology, it was supposed to be this great liberalizer, the great democratizer of our world. It was supposed to air marginalized voices and give power and diffuse it into the hands of the people instead of concentrating it in with the most powerful. But instead, as we say in the essay, I think the reality is turning out to be a lot more complicated. And we're seeing a lot of that in what people have called techlash now. So sort of a backlash against how these technologies are demanding our attention, and it's not necessarily all for the good. And then there's the national security context too. So these things are in tension, where, as I talked about before, there's a rise and a spread of a liberalism, which is our big combating high-tech liberalism project. So that culture and those forms and systems of governance seem to be in increasing contest with free and open societies. And the problem is that these technologies give them, they enable certain dictators in whether they're in Gulf states, whether they're in African states, whether they're in China, to sort of increase their control over populations. And we entitled this new suite of technologies the Autocrat's New Toolkit. And before I lose you entirely, these are composed of 5 core technologies that we identified and brought out. And there's many more, but some of the ones that you'll recognize pretty easily are facial recognition technologies, synthetic media. Maybe you guys have heard of deep fakes. So these are AI-enabled digital forgeries, which can make people on video look like they're doing something they're not. There's a really creepy one of Jennifer Lawrence and Steve Buscemi that's sort of circulating on YouTube right now. I encourage you to check it out if you want to be thoroughly scared. And then they have lifelike automated bots. So we dealt with a lot of this at Facebook. You know, people, bots are, especially in the social media context, are these they're automated and controlled by software. And I'm sure you've seen them before. They sort of generate propaganda, potentially, messaging. Micro-targeting is also a technology that we highlight. So there are plenty of commercial uses for micro-targeting right now. In 2016, Google actually admitted that in the election, they labeled users right-leaning or left-leaning. So take that, automate it, put it at scale across populations, and you can increase the breadth, efficiency, and precision of messaging for your population. And it has a temporal element too. What if a swing district at a particular time in an election is targeted, and you take all of the voting population and you dump these messages on them at a specific time? Then we're talking election influence at that point. So that's another thing. And then the last technology that we highlighted was an application of machine learning that we used for counterterrorism at Facebook called natural language processing. And some of you nerds out there might have heard of OpenAI's new GPT-2 platform, which basically allows a computer to generate language as if it were written by a human. So what we had to think about was, what are the implications for propaganda if somebody gets their hands on that code and uses it to generate propaganda at scale that sounds like a human is actually making it up? So those are the 5 technologies we highlight in the piece. I encourage you to read it. Wall Street Journal Saturday essay 2 weeks ago, the Autocrat's New Toolkit. And we basically said, this is a problem, but technology itself, you know, it's some people argue whether it's neutral or not, but it's not inherently good or bad. It depends on who wields it and how. That makes all the difference. And we can talk about how to harness these technologies for good later, but I'll give Harlan a chance to answer his last question.
Thanks, Kara. Harlan, in your work you said innovation and invention in the military risk becoming aspirational platitudes. So I applauded that when I read that. I had the same idea, just not as eloquent. You went on to say there's a 4-step process, or you propose a 4-step process for innovation. I think that's something that I know I lack, and a lot of my classmates and others in the school, you know, here we need to innovate, but we don't know how to innovate. Can you go over that 4-step process for everybody, and maybe developing an individual's process to be more innovative?
I don't want to repeat what I said about a brains-based approach and shock and awe. So let me come at it a different way. How do you know the enemy? All right, I'm going to pursue this in terms of innovation. How many of you read the report on cyber vulnerability done for the Secretary of the Navy that came out 2 weeks ago? Raise your hands. Shame on you. Shame on you. This is vital. How many of you know who General Gerasimov is? Raise your hands. And how many of you know what the Gerasimov doctrine is? I want you to pursue this in terms of innovation. Vladimir Putin, whatever you think about him, is brilliant. He has concocted a strategy that I call a cyber blitzkrieg. The cyber blitzkrieg is being used against the West. He not only intervened in our elections, I suspect that he may have helped affect votes in 3 key states. He also intervened in Brexit, and I think helped stack the deck. So there is a cyber offensive writ large called active measures that's being pursued against us, and it is extremely dynamic. he has now militarized this. When I talk about 3 o'clock in the morning and the lights go out, how many of you have reviewed the Russian campaign in Ukraine and what the Russians have done in terms of electronics, in terms of EMP weapons, in terms of electromagnetic warfare? When I said the kid who could take a cell phone out and turn the lights out, we're doing a project at the Naval War College called Breaking the Mold. The Chief of Naval Operations doesn't like that title, so we've changed it. But we had a young naval officer suggest how he could take out an Aegis destroyer tomorrow in cyber. Now, whether he can do that or not, I don't know. But my point is, we have a cyber attack coming at us in terms of active measures. This has been militarized, and what have we done to deal with it? Our strategy in Europe was to enhance conventional defense with the European Defense Initiative, putting a handful of troops in the Baltics, and then reinforcing. But if you read Chinese literature, anybody read Unrestricted Warfare in 1999 by 2 PLA colonels? What do they say they're going to do? They're going to take out our tip fit and tip fiddle. Everybody know what that is, tip fit, tip fiddle? If not, you better learn. So the adversary is coming at us from an entirely different direction. They are outflanking us. And the only way we're going to respond is to know what they're doing and to think through how do we circumvent that. That does not require a great deal of money, but it requires the most precious of all resources, what General Gray and Bobby Jones said, what's between your ears. That's how I come at innovation.
Thanks.
Can I weigh in on that?
Sure, definitely.
So I think this institution, the Marine Corps, absolutely knows how to innovate. And I'm going to be like a fanboy here, but I actually brought my 1997 copy of MCDP-1. And thanks to these gentlemen in the front row. And this is it. Everything you need to know to run a company is right here. It's right here. And we do it. It's in our DNA. It's in our blood. We do it on the battlefield all the time. Apply these principles in the classroom, too. And we actually heard some of it this morning in the overview of the curriculum at the Krulak Center. There was one component of the overview was a major talking about design of classes, essentially students designing classes. The class ends when it ends. They read what the students want to read. It was essentially a self-directed group study. I think that's how innovation happens. Monocultures don't generally innovate very well. Innovation comes from diversity. It comes from pushing decision-making down and out in an organization, empowering junior leaders, giving them the freedom to fail, holding them accountable, expecting them to fail, but fail fast, learn, and don't make the same mistake twice. We do it on the battlefield all the time. It's all right here. And if we can apply that inside our companies and inside our classrooms, I think this is right within our grasp.
So I think some of my classmates are very happy you brought up CDP-1.
That was not planned.
I didn't give it to him
It's been on my desk for 15 years.
Excellent. So today, and you mentioned it, Nate, today the Marine Corps University cut the ribbon on the Krulak Center. The Krulak Center has been designed and developed to promote innovation and creativity, but it's part of a large bureaucracy, and I think you kind of mentioned that with your comments. So I'll open this to all three of you here on the panel is, what recommendations do you have or views do you have that maybe could help the Krulak Center reach their goal? Or, maybe we've thought about it, maybe we haven't, but, please share with us.
I gave mine prematurely. I'm sorry, Kara. Harlan.
So I would say, thank you. I would say that, and I talk about this a lot, and imagination is kind of one of those tropes that people, it's fallen out of fashion a little bit, but the education piece is so essential, and we need to find imaginative ways to get people into the government, get people into Silicon Valley, figure out a way for people who, want to take part in solving these hard problems, because what do engineers do but solve problems? Give them, whet their appetites for some sort of service in the government. There's the green shoots that you talked about, Nate, are already sprouting, and we work with places like the Defense Innovation Board, the Defense Innovation Unit, the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, and then there's DSS, Kessel Run, those places that are sort of allowing people to get a taste of how or what solving these problems is like, but then let them go into the private sector and then let them come back. So I think we do have to figure out ways to make people understand what it means to serve your country and then work in the private sector and then potentially come back. So if you guys want to go to the private sector after this, do that, learn those skills, and then come back and transfer them to national security issues, the hardest problems that we're working on in the global security stage at this point too. And then I also think that we can start closer to home. So there's a series of recommendations that all sort of point to, that we have at CNAS, that point to creating an environment conducive to the behaviors that you're seeking to encourage. And there are ways to do this in the Department of Defense, like incentivizing measurable common data standards, shifting investments toward commercial solutions, not just committing to bespoke systems, but letting people encourage plug-and-play architectures, have resilient C4 ISR architectures, especially as we're talking about contested environments. And then also, in terms of data, sort of create an opt-out culture, vice an opt-in culture. So a lot of times in your intelligence agencies, in DoD right now, when people are taking data, they have to sort of opt in to share their data. So instead, if we have to opt out to share our data and then incentivize certain agencies to actually store that data, because storing data is very expensive, I think that those are some concrete steps that we can take to encourage the IT environment, the bureaucratic environment, and even the cultural environment, because data sharing is essentially a component of the culture in DoD, and it's first steps for creating environments that are conducive, again, to the behaviors that we're seeking to encourage, especially with regard to the work that the Krulak Center is doing.
I have a different approach. I think this requires intellectual courage and leadership to challenge the status quo. My argument is that the greatest threat facing the Department of Defense today is inbuilt, uncontrolled cost growth of 5 to 7% a year. That's for people, that's for stuff, that's for weapons. And unless we can control that, because as Senator Warner will testify, this budget is probably the last budget increase you're going to see. The deficit is mounting. And this inbuilt cost growth, I mean, an airplane costs $100 million, $15 billion for an aircraft carrier. And by the way, Breaking the Mold said we shouldn't build any more nuclear aircraft carriers. Is probably one of the reasons why the Chief of Naval Operations was quite unhappy with it. So you've really got to break the mold. You've got to use history as a way of exercising your intellectual muscles to talents where you are right now. Let me go back to Guadalcanal. In the interwar years, the Navy knew that it had torpedoes. The Navy knew it had radar. But nobody really knew how to use it. We didn't have a signal book. The code word for open fire in those days was Roger. And so when you said Roger out, inadvertently, you were saying open fire. So no matter what people think about the interwar years, we did a lot of stupid things. I think you have to take a look at doctrine. I think you have to take a look at tactics. And you've got to be able, within the bounds of reason, to challenge those. How can you do this differently? That's what General Gray did. That's what General Krulak did. But it takes intellectual courage, and it takes political leadership above you to tolerate risk. Whether you like it or not, the government is a risk avoidance operation. Nobody wants to take risk. And it's one thing that we have to do. We can do it intellectually. And what you have here at the Marine Corps University, and I'm preaching to the choir, is the opportunity to think fresh. Challenge those assumptions. For example, challenge our strategy in Europe. I don't think it will work. I do think a porcupine defense will work. You don't want to pet a porcupine. The Russians aren't going to come west, but if you have a defense that makes it really difficult, that takes on active measures, it's not going to cost a lot of money. In the Pacific, the idea of invading China, as General Jack Sheehan said, and I won't quote him precisely, but he said, we don't have enough bullets. We should be looking at a maritime line of defense that traps the Chinese within the first island chain. There are all sorts of smart things that we should be doing. with active measures. And what you have to do creatively is sit down, look at history, see why things worked or why things did not work, and then try to apply them today to your tactics, to your procedures, to the technology. What can you do to make the Marine Corps and the services more effective, more innovative, and see if you can do it, as Putin is doing it, by the way, by cutting defense spending. That's what innovation is about. You have 6 months or a year here to do it, and as Arleigh Burke said, if you don't do it, nobody else is.
Okay, now we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Microphones will be made available. Please introduce yourself and identify if your question is for the whole panel or a specific member to identify. So.
Hi, good morning. Major Deanna DeToro from Command and Staff College. So thank you for your comments and for your time. One thing I was thinking about as we're sitting here, wholeheartedly agree. Would love to see innovation. Would love to see better efforts at talent management. If you could give me some of your thoughts on how we could either work through, work around, bust through, break through the mold with regards to our HR and talent management, as well as acquisition systems, and kind of comment your thoughts on how they strangle out the innovation that you're directly speaking about.
We just finished an effort called, please sit down, Major, called Education for Sea Power. I'm not going to talk about the Marine Corps. The U.S. Navy does not manage its talent, period. In terms of education, you've got very, very good institutions, but they're not coordinated. Now, right now, General Bowers is working with Admiral Rondeau at the Naval PG School for the first time to work these things together. In the Navy, and I'll speak for the other services, we do very, very badly in terms of coordinating the Federal Executive Fellow Program, or indeed flag officer education. Admiral X or General Y now goes out to become Commander-in-Chief, whatever. How much time does he or she have to prepare for that? Zero. Zero. Why? Because the law regulates how many flag officers you can have at any good time. So my view is that you've got to seize this. You need to take a look at talent from private to general and seaman to admiral. Because in some cases, you've got youngsters who are far more competent in these kinds of things, and the system is based on the 19th century, not the 20th century, in terms of talent management. This requires, and quite frankly, the Navy is trying to do this with Sailor 2025, where on your cell phone you can do virtually everything. People are the most important asset we have, and we tend to forget that. And their management is far more important. I don't know that we can do it through the N1 bureaucracies, the personnel bureaucracies we have. But we've got to start from realizing that from the time you enter the service, you are a great asset, and education is absolutely vital, and you as an individual have to be managed on a personal level with somebody who's looking after you regardless of your rank. We have to change our structures to do that. The Navy is trying to do that. I cannot speak for the Marine Corps. But unless or until we really understand that people are our most important product and nurture them, it's always going to be very, very difficult. And I can't give you a better answer than that, Major, but it's a very good question.
So I think a very distilled way to think about it is talent and education are a strategic imperative. So we haven't always thought this way, especially in the tech field, right? We kind of just took it for granted that we get hotshot engineers and that's the way it goes. But in the military, software isn't sexy. Like nobody really gets promoted for adding 20% efficiencies or capabilities to a currently existing national mission initiative. So again, it comes down to the culture, right? Not just an IT environment in this instance, but if we start promoting people for what they do with regard to software rather than hardware and people getting the F-35 and whatnot, then I think that sort of changes the way people think about incentivizing promotions and what the Marine Corps and what DoD actually values. Air Force is actually doing an interesting thing with regard to education. So when it comes to languages, the Air Force unveiled a new initiative where they're now treating treating Python and I think SQL as an actual foreign language. So they're giving their airmen the credit for basically their coding skills and saying, yeah, that's equal to Farsi, that's equal to Arabic. So they're rolling that out. We'll see how successful that is. But to me, those are kind of the glimmers of hope that we're starting to say that we value these things vice what we just valued in the past. And I'm not decrying the past. I think it absolutely matters. History matters. I was a history major in college, so I think it is very important to learn those lessons and learn them well, but we can also innovate on top of those too. In terms of stifling the innovation in Silicon Valley, I think it's really interesting because there is a cultural chasm, right, between having walked the halls of Facebook myself, where people there really believe that they are a force for good in the world, and were squeamish when shaking my hand after finding out I worked for the National Security Agency. I think there is the culture divide. Is, it exists, it's there. But at the same time, we have to understand some of the economic incentives that aren't encouraging things like AI startups to flourish and to be able to work with the government, like funding timelines potentially being off. So we need to have a fulsome consideration of what motivates these companies to innovate, to work with the government, to help their country and act accordingly as the US government.
So I lead an organization in one of the most intensely competitive talent environments in our economy. And so recruiting and retaining people is literally the #1 issue on my mind every day. And the challenge is we can lose them to any place, but an advantage is we can also hire them from any place. And that's a big difference between your organization and mine. There are 2 institutions in American life that I can think of off the top of my head that get their senior leadership only from within. And those are the church and the military, where you're not doing lateral hires into the general officer ranks or to be a bishop or the pope or whatever. And so that imposes some really challenging and unique constraints on the military when it comes to talent management. There's been a lot of social science research around why people do what they do. What are we looking for in our work? And it boils down, a lot of it boils down to 3 things. And again, I don't want to reduce this to being meaningless, but 3 things that we as leaders can do inside our organizations to recruit and retain people. People want the ability to develop mastery in their work. We do something because we like it and we want to be good at it and have opportunities to get better at it, right? So we need to give our people the opportunity to develop that mastery, training, mentorship, leadership, professional education opportunities, hands-on growth. The military is very good at that. People want a sense of purpose. They want to know why they're getting up in the morning. Why am I building this widget? There's a great parable about the three men building a brick wall, and a passerby asks the first one, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm laying bricks." And he asks the second one, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm building a wall." And he asks the third one, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm building a cathedral." And so just framing the purpose of what you're doing for your team, I think, make a huge difference. And the military is wonderfully good at that. But the third piece is autonomy. So mastery, purpose, and autonomy. People want a certain degree, generally, of autonomy in their work. They don't want their boss breathing down their neck all the time. The military is terrible at that one. Awful. I mean, among the worst institutions when it comes to that. And so I think, I'm not an expert on military personnel reform, so I'm not the guy to talk to about this, but giving you one guy's soda straw view from a highly competitive piece of the private sector economy, I would say get better overall at providing people with measures of autonomy in their careers. And don't talk about comprehensive personnel reform. That doesn't work. Pilot stuff. Try little things and see if they work, and try a bunch of them. And if they don't work, turn them off. And if they do work, turn them up. So creative on-ramps and off-ramps, internships, exchanges, graduate school, sabbaticals. People should be able to take 2 years off when they have a kid and say, you know what, I'm going to come back. And maybe I pay a professional price for that. I get it, but that's okay. I'm willing to pay the price, but don't make me leave forever, right? All kinds of little things that could be done, I think, because you got the mastery part down pretty well, got the purpose part down really well, but we're really failing on the autonomy piece.
We have a question down here, microphone.
Good afternoon, everybody. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Brennan with the Marine Corps War College. I'm an aviator. We spend a lot of time talking about software, technology, widgets, gear. I'd really like to talk about the future of human performance and why are we not pursuing biological enhancement, biological mechanical interface in the human performance engine, cloning. I'm talking like real deep future stuff here. I'm not talking 2025, I'm talking 2150. Where are we with those kind of mindsets? When are we going to start doing that kind of stuff? I mean, I've seen some minor kind of haphazard portions of it when a doc handed me amphetamine to go fly a jet for 11 hours. But I don't think that was really well thought through, right? And so I think there's some stuff out there that we could do that we are not performing in that theater at all because of ethical and moral considerations. Can any of you talk about that, please?
All right, so you asked where we are behind China. If you guys haven't seen, I don't know how many of you are on Twitter right now, but we've determined that China has cloned the first military working dog, I think as of a few weeks ago. And the point is, not to, again, vilify a particular nation, but at the same time, we do know that they are operating under a different set of scruples than we are in America. And we talk a lot about this when we talk about fully autonomous weapons and lethal autonomous weapons generally. Basically, there's no real true appetite in the Pentagon to unleash, the power of weapons that can hunt, seek, and actually target and pull the trigger themselves. So I think we can make an analogy to some of these things as well. Like there's no true appetite in, the bowels of that building that says, yes, we need to go after human performance enhancements 100%. However, we are kind of dipping our toe in the water. These consist of things like, I don't know if you guys have heard of the Talos suit, sort of the failed SOCOM endeavor where they tried to make an Iron Man suit, and now they're sort of like, okay, we might have overpromised a little bit, so sort of back to the drawing board on that. We have elements of that, though, in some of the exosuits and exoskeletons that are complementary to what a human can do. So it pretty much just consists of, putting knee braces on and letting somebody run longer and faster or carry a little more weight, that kind of thing. So we're dabbling. I think people are thinking about these problems, but I think the major impediment is the fact that, we do have a set of American principles born out of our culture and our value of life. And, the human person and the individual is not necessarily sacrosanct, but it's very important for us to keel towards those ideals rather than give them up in a CRISPR-like situation, which you've probably seen China has just done. And for those of you who don't know about the CRISPR situation, in China, basically, a scientist figured out a way to make humans' brains work better and smarter. This is just kind of the TLDR version. But he was sanctioned by the scientific community, and that community generally is given to a lot of self-policing. So I think the appetite is, hasn't really permeated our society at this point. If even in China they're sort of saying, okay, we're going to pull back a little bit. So it sort of opens up Pandora's box, and people aren't willing to go all in just yet.
There are obviously huge moral, legal, and ethical issues here. When you think about what used to be called the $6 Million Man, I mean, that dates me. You also have David versus Goliath. So I'm not sure that all these human enhancements are really going to work if you come up with some kind of an Arnold Schwarzenegger creature of the future. Where there is an area for breakthrough, and John Allen goes into this in great detail, is the machine-brain interface. And that's where there's an awful lot of potential in which it enables decision-making to be made much, much more rapidly. That's the area where one, I think, would tend to look in terms of aiding decision-making. But I think there are limits on human performance, and there are always workarounds. And quite frankly, the fact that we do have legal, moral, and ethical restrictions is probably a very, very good thing. You don't want to create Frankensteins on the one hand. On the other hand, I do think that this human-brain interface machine is an area which is going to have far greater impact in the future.
Good morning, Kemshin, student over at EWS. This is for Dr. Harlan Ullman, and to borrow General Allen's phrase of hyperwar. So acknowledging the nature of warfare as constant, we talk about the conflict of human wills, human endeavor, chance, violence, but namely war being an extension of policy. Will a hyperwar environment necessitate a relative rate of change in policy? So as war is to policy, does a hyperwar scenario change that dynamic? So essentially, does a hyperwar require hyperpolicy?
That's a really good question. Everything is relative. I mean, when you think about the 17 and 1800s, you went with the speed of a sailing ship, and decision-making was appropriate to that. We're now engaged in a world which is globalized and interconnected, and things happen at the speed of CNN or Fox News. And unfortunately, our decision-making capability right now is extraordinarily limited because somebody can't just sit in the Oval Office or an E-ring in the Pentagon and say, do this, because there's going to be all sorts of other issues that are attached, especially in complicated things where it's going to require use of force. We have to think our way through this command and control environment in which we are able to make decisions far more better informed than we can. As you know, the first piece of information in war is always wrong, or it tends to be very, very wrong. This is where, if you take my view of knowledge and understanding, and you can put in place things I didn't talk about, but I've written some papers I've given to General Bowers about updating a kind of a Bletchley Park that enables you to know more about the enemy, a companycommander.com that General Jack Keane, Vice Chief of the Army, put in place in Iraq, so that we can enable better information. That's where we have to be able to be far better off. Because you can't just come into the White House and say, Mr. President, this is a life or death situation, and then the president says, I need more information. Now, we have the technology to do it, but we need a new command and control structure, in my mind, for the 21st century that brings to bear, with great rapidity, the knowledge and understanding that makes informed decisions. That's going to be the real issue that's at stake here. We have to make sure our command and control is up to the speed of light decisions that are going to have to be made. And I think that there's technology and education to make that happen.
I'm a visual learner, so maybe I can try to put some of that in a chart that I use when I give a talk on cybersecurity that gets to this point. I think the cyber world is characterized by 4 vectors that are moving in the same direction. Imagine 4 arrows in parallel, but they're moving at different speeds. And the fastest of them is the tech. And the tech's evolving very, very rapidly. Hard on its heels are social norms, the second vector. And anybody who has kids of a certain age knows that we adapt very quickly to what's technically possible. But then there's a huge gap back to the third vector, which is law. And then even behind that one, the slowest and the fourth is policy. And all the interesting stuff is happening in the middle between, right, in that gap between what is technically feasible and there's some social acceptance of it, but there's no legal or policy framework to govern its use. And so as I think about it, it's how do we accelerate the speed of those bottom vectors, because we know we can't slow the top 2.
Kara, is that something that in the autocrat's new toolkit is what China is exploiting? Is that gap that, you know, between hyperwar, hyperpolicy, and what Nate describes in the policy catching up to the technology? Is that what you're trying to describe with that?
Yeah, I think to a degree, obviously we can't really control how other nations necessarily use technologies, but there are international bodies that are sort of attempting to do so, like the CCWGGE process that goes on in the United Nations when they talk about lethal autonomous weapons, because it is something that has the potential to sort of wreak havoc given the diffuse nature of a lot of these technologies. Once they're out of the bag, you can't necessarily put them back. So I think the strategy thus far has been to sort of coalesce around certain key principles. It's funny, the UNGGE meetings, they basically spend weeks and weeks and weeks arguing over the definition of lethal autonomous weapons. So, that's where they are. When we talk about governance and policy catching up to technological development that is vastly outpacing it, I mean, these governance bodies or attempts to govern are not even there. They're just sort of defining what the technology is. So the stopgap has been to say, here's a principle. Each nation sort of declares a principle. Some nations agree with them, some don't. In the United States, what we are basically pushing forward is that the role of human judgment in deploying these technologies is critical. So some, semantics and definitions aside, we have determined that this is the fundamental principle that we will organize all of our directives and laws around, and everything will naturally feed into that and flow from that as well. So that's one way to do it, determine these principles first and foremost. And then I think, in the Autocrat's new toolkit, keeping an eye on how these technologies can be exploited, especially for social control of populations and put to malicious use, keeping that awareness in the forefront of policymakers, decision makers' minds, and then figuring out, how to contest it. We talked a little bit about ways to harness the technology for good. So I'll come back to it right now. And, what does that mean? Coding deepfake detection algorithms, using bot detectors. So figuring out how this technology can sort of stem the tide of illiberal use or just plain malicious use is one way to do it. But I think the principles and then figuring out creative ways to confront it, even using the technology against itself, like increasing situational awareness, increasing the intel picture with artificial intelligence that parses through the data, that finds and detects these anomalies, that automates these tasks that a commander or a person no longer has to do. You don't want an FMV analyst sitting in front of a screen trying to detect what a rock is, what a truck is, what a tree is. Let machines do what machines do best and employ them appropriately. And then you can sort of contest some of the bad behaviors that these countries are really investing in.
Senator Warner, you have a question?
If I may. Forgive me for being seated. At 92, getting out of the chair, you spend half the time getting out of the chair and not speaking. So I'm going to kick it off right away. I was privileged under this wonderful system we live in this country to be a member of the United States Senate for 30 years. And I retired 10 years ago, and I'm a little bit rusty on certain aspects of Capitol Hill. I purposely am because I didn't want to be one of those guys that resigned one day and went back the next and put his hand in the cookie jar to load his wallet up. So anyway, I'm where I am happily doing other things, but I'm swinging on a hook to come back to this subject because in World War II, I was a electronic technician's mate and graduated from the national big laboratory over here. This was World War II was still cooking. And I knew a good deal about electronics and how things worked on a ship. I haven't got that knowledge today. So my question to you is as follows. I always like to introduce everything with a little story, but I've always been fascinated with Willie Sutton. Well, why do you rob banks? Well, that's where the money is. Well, the money's up there on Capitol Hill, but in my brief study the last couple of months of this subject, I don't see in the old budget that I handle, I didn't have a nickel in it when I left on these general subjects. Do you see a growing interest in gaining the knowledge and the funding that needs to go into these programs, whatever they may be, to bring us even alongside China or Russia?
Can I answer that?
Sure, start, Howard.
Senator, first, and I say this with great respect, you are sorely missed on Capitol Hill. And that's one of the problems
They're
we've
still looking for me, but they haven't called me to go to jail yet.
Only that were true. We have a problem. In my mind, the fundamental issue is we have a system of organization that goes back to 1947 and the National Security Act. It does not work, period. We have a $750 billion budget. Are you kidding? We don't have enough money? And the problem, in my view, is that we are not properly organized to do it. Now, the Congress has given certain authorities to the services to be able to be more creative, which is a really good step. But unfortunately, because each of the services is wedded to platforms, and they have been, you take a look at the Army's top 6 or the Navy's top 3 or whatever, we need to break that mold, and we need to look at more intellectual things. The money is there, but it's going to take a very, very brave Secretary of Defense and a chairman who are going to have to break the mold. And as much as I hate to say it, the Navy cannot be wedded to nuclear carriers forever. The Army cannot be wedded to tanks and fighting vehicles, and the Air Force cannot be wedded to B-21s and F-35s, which are overly expensive, and I think there are other things to do the job. We need courage at the very level to start saying we have to look at things differently, and that means changes to the National Security Act. I will offend everybody with a suggestion I made some years ago. I think the chairman, the Joint Chiefs should be separate from the service chiefs. I think that the Joint Chiefs should be giving strategic advice to the Secretary and the President, and they ought to be the decision makers, and the service chiefs ought to be running the services, and they're different. They're split. That's one way that we can be able to get more nonpartisan agreement on what needs to be done. Because as you know, the budget has been split 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So we've got to change the basic organization. If we don't do that, my fear is that internal uncontrolled cost growth could easily lead to a hollow force. General Krulak, General Gray, and I were victims of that hollow force. Under no circumstances would I like to ever see that happening again. But we have to be brave enough to say we've got to change the overall organization to do that, to respond to the question that you rightly raised. How do we put the right amount of money in other areas when the bureaucracies and the industrial base are opposed to it?
I think Dr. Ullman is exactly right. And as the former Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bob Work, and also a former Marine is fond of saying, is these initiatives need a champion in the Pentagon. You know, if you don't allocate responsibility to a certain person or an entity, then it's never going to get done. In the way of artificial intelligence, I'll talk about it because it's what I know best. The Joint Artificial Intelligence Center in DoD has been given responsibility for AI defense applications of artificial intelligence. So we've got step one, right? Is that we've allocated responsibility. We said you are the person or the entity that needs to make sure that this gets done. But again, there needs to be, Shanahan is doing a good job, General Shanahan, Air Force General, is doing a good job of this right now. But yeah, there needs to be responsibility allocated and there needs to be a champion. And I do think the tide is turning. One of the things that gave us pause when the executive order on artificial intelligence was rolled out, in addition to the Department of Defense AI strategy, budgetary concerns were not really discussed, at least in the unclassified version. And we held an event where the new CTO of the White House, we basically were like, hey, so where's the money going? Are we getting money for this? Because it doesn't matter. If there's no money, it's not going to happen. It's just kind of a dream at this point. So they were a little bit cagey about if the money has been properly allocated to these initiatives. But I do think at the same time, because these hard questions are being asked of them, they've been sort of forced to potentially disclose some of these investments. The JIAC, they just revealed in the budget how much money they're getting, and it's a decent amount. So I think that there is hope, but right now there are two conditions that have to be met, and that's having a champion and having responsibility allocated.
Senator, it's an honor to be here with you this morning, or this afternoon now, sir. Just one cultural observation. When I go to the Hill as a private sector expert or representative, the members tend to want to score political points and the staff members all want jobs. When I go to the West Coast and talk about policy or the Hill, everybody looks at me and says, well, why does that matter? It's not even contempt, it's just no acknowledgement that it even matters. And so there's clearly a divide that has to get bridged here. Anecdotally, maybe some of it's generational on the technology side. There's a young member who's a former Marine, Mike Gallagher, another who's a former CIA officer, Will Hurd. You can name people who get it on both sides of the aisle, who are fluent enough in the technology to arguably provide some reasonable policy oversight. But I think as we saw in the hearings recently with a bunch of West Coast technology leaders who came in, it was more or less a farce. And so there's a long way to go. I can't comment with any real insight on the budget itself, but I think there's a cultural chasm and a little bit of a generational divide that is gradually growing its way out of the system.
Do we have the time, given where China...
So that's a great point. Do we have the time? And this is a drum that I try to beat. Our response from a cyber policy standpoint is too often crisis-driven. But the crisis that we're looking for, the cyber 9/11 or the cyber Pearl Harbor, I think it's the wrong framework. The problem's already here. And imagine if our geopolitical adversaries were shooting down American-flagged airliners or were hijacking American-flagged ships. But that's exactly what's happening in the cyber domain every day. And so the crisis is here, and it's happening every single day. But because it doesn't make for a fiery visual, somehow we're not acting as if, we're not talking about it in the present tense. We're still talking about it in the future tense.
Senator, if I could, I think we have the time, but let me caveat that. I think, I go back to knowledge and understanding. I don't think we understand the grave weaknesses that China and Russia have. China has an underclass of possibly 500 million people. They've got a huge real estate debt. They're shifting from an export-driven economy to a consumer-driven economy. They have huge internal problems, and I think we tend to exaggerate. Now, they're stealing our stuff, they're into our stuff, I got all that. In terms of Russia, as John McCain famously said, it's a gas station with nuclear weapons, and it's no longer a gas station. The reason why Vladimir Putin is cutting back on defense spending is he's got a huge domestic problem. Now, where the Chinese and the Russians are ahead of us, I hate to say this, they're smarter than we are. Putin's strategy for this blitzkrieg is brilliant, and we're not taking the debate. And President Xi, whatever you think about him, is qualified for as long as China's existed. They've had very, very, very qualified senior people at the top levels, including all the princelings, because they get the top, along with the princelings, to Beijing. We've not been able to emulate that. So I think we have the time because of the inherent weaknesses that exist in China and Russia. We don't recognize that stuff, and so we may be creating artificial problems, and we're not realizing this is an intellectual issue in which we got to be smarter than they are. That's what we have to face, and that's where we're falling behind. But I think we've got more time than we think, despite the fact that the Chinese, and if nobody's read this book on, what is it called, Superpower AI and the Silicon Valley by K.F. Lee, it's a brilliant book. And the sum and substance is, if we think the Chinese are malicious and thieving offshore, they're even worse at home. And that's something that we have to realize. But I do think we have the time if we use it. Let's not exaggerate the danger, but let's recognize where the danger is, and we've not done, in my estimation, a good enough job of doing that.
Before closing, I'd like to offer General Krulak, a great Marine innovator, the opportunity to add any final remarks. General?
I just discovered that I was going to talk, so I know, but well, I just want to show you up. He never, for those who were there at the once, he told the story of him when I was on the stretcher and he pinched my on the toe, and you know, What he failed to recall is that when he was a senator, he was being operated on, and guess who went as the commandant to U.S. Naval Hospital Bethesda and grabbed him by the toe and said, "Don't worry, young man, you'll be okay." He's a coward for not telling that part. I obviously do not have the expertise that you all have, and I think you've done a superb job. I would make a couple of remarks about what my father would be saying right now, what I say, and I'm sure that General Gray would say the same thing, is a lot of what I heard was adapting. That's dangerous. I never thought about adapting. And I can tell you the Brute never thought about adapting. Adapting means you're responding to something. We talk in terms of agility. You've got to be agile, and I think that's what you all are driving at. Agile means you're anticipating. You're on the crest of the wave. You're going to catch the wave. You're going to ride the curl. You're not just, oh my gosh, the Chinese, or oh my gosh, the Russians, or whatever have got this or got that. We got to get ahead of them. We got to be far more aggressive. Now, the question on the budget was a brilliant question. Guess what, gang? We can't do a damn thing about it. All you got to do is suck it up, because you're going to lose money. 2 years from now, it's going down. Right, Al? Am I right there? Say yeah.
Doesn't cost any money to think.
Yeah, costs no money to think. We're going to lose money. We're going to lose money. So we've got to do just what General Gray said. We got to think. We got to quit thinking about training. Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected. That's what we're faced with, a world of chaos, a world of the unexpected. We got to be agile. And until people like yourselves can convince the Congress that we do have a serious problem that we're facing, it's up to us. It's up to you. It's the people in this room who've done it day in and day out. The 6 inches that General Gray was talking about, you own it. I add another little foot down to your soul. You're Marines. You're Marines. We don't allow adapting in our lexicon. We anticipate and we go for it. And so I think you all did a great job. I think that you ought to take your panel and go up on the hill. Go up on the hill. As for Harlan Ullman and his discussion about the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Joint Chiefs, at 13:30 today, I invite you all out in front of the flagpole where he and I are going to go 2 rounds, winner take all.
Thank you, General. And Harlan, Kara, Nate, thank you for participating today. Thank everybody for the questions and attendance. Be sure to continue discussing ideas about the future and ways to improve the Corps, the military, and our country. And I'll say this, just please remain seating for the departure of the official party and for the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.